Rolling Stones. Jagger's energetic performance of tracks like Jumping Jack Flash and the band's outrageous behaviour offstage was horrifying parents, churches and the authorities. Author Simon Wells has written a major work on the band.
The Rolling Stones during the 60s, they were the bad boys, they were the rough kids. You know, if the Beatles are Jesus Christ, they were the devil.
Today, outrageous rock bands like the Stones are commonplace, but in 1967, they were new. And many believe, among them Philip Norman, the paranoia the Stones created was so great that the American government conspired to destroy them.
The two chief Stones, the two objects of terror in the band, were busted. They were put on trial. They were jailed.
Philip Norman claims that the FBI were behind a drugs raid in 1967, which led to the arrest and jailing of both Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. And this was a plot to prevent them from ever entering and touring the United States. If Norman's theory is correct, it all began when an alleged Canadian drug dealer, David Sniderman, nicknamed Acid King Dave, was stopped by customs at London's Heathrow Airport.
He had landed with drugs in his luggage, which had been found. He had expected to be locked up and then deported, which was the sort of thing that would usually happen. What he described as some heavy people had then started to talk to him and offered him a deal. He would be let off and allowed to go back to the States if he would infiltrate or try to infiltrate the Rolling Stones circle and give them acid, which would allow the police to raid them and bust them.
Norman believes that British customs passed Sniderman on to their FBI colleagues, who, he claims, realized very quickly that the drug Sniderman was carrying could be the perfect way to destroy the Rolling Stones. If the band were caught red-handed with those drugs, they would never get the visa they needed to perform in America. If this theory is to be believed, then everything fell into place in February 1967, when Sniderman engineered a meeting with Keith Richards.
Keith Richards attracted a lot of people from the sort of shady margins of the drug-dealing world. And he'd met David Sniderman, who promised him some special LSD that weekend called Sunshine.
Richards invited Acid King Dave to join Mick Jagger and some other friends at his country home, Redlands, for the weekend.
Redlands is a cottage in Sussex near the small seaside hamlet of West Wittering. It became a sort of hangout, a place for the Stones to rehearse.
On Sunday, February the 12th, 1967, it's claimed the party took Sniderman's acid and then went for a walk on West Wittering Beach. This photograph of Sniderman with Keith Richards was taken that day. As the group returned to Redlands for the night, the alleged plot was swinging into action. According to music journalist Simon Wells, a tip-off had reached the local police, who now began planning a drugs raid.
They had to rally their troops, and this meant pulling in beat bobbies from Bognor and Selsey. You know, the characters who'd be going around on push bikes, who were all drafted into this raid which would change the cultural history of the 20th century.
As the police drove to the house, Richards and his guests were still high on Sniderman's drugs.
All these characters, Marianne Faithfull, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, are sitting down. This is very 60s. They've got a little flashing strobe light going off in the corner.
But outside, Detective Constable Evelyn Fuller was about to make rock and roll history.
And then, you know, a face appears at the window, and someone says, "Oh, look, there's a girl at the window." So it's probably a fan. Ignore it.
What happened next is documented in court records. There was a knock at the door, and when Keith Richards answered it, Chief Inspector Gordon Dinley showed him a warrant and immediately began to search the premises.
Keith Richards has since said in his tripped-out state that he thought when this black surge of the uniforms appeared, you know, all he could see was the flashing silver buttons, and he thought, wow, it's cosmic, you know, what are these goblins doing here from another planet?
A rumour started going around that when the police had arrived, Mick was performing a sexual act on Marianne that involved a Mars bar.
Give that to a journalist, and it immediately becomes a complete distortion.
There was no chocolate bar at all, but this has become one of the longest-lived myths in rock culture.
For an eager press, it was the kind of rock and roll detail they were hungry for, regardless of how true it was.
Of course, in the minds of the police, it was immediately turned into a sexual orgy as well as a drugs orgy.
But it was the drugs that was going to get the Stones arrested. Key to this conspiracy theory is the claim that Sniderman's case was never searched, and he was allowed to vanish. Instead, the police focused on Jagger and Richards. But despite searching the house, the police found very little evidence of drugs.
For the amount of personnel on the raid, they found very little. They found some scrapings of hashish off a stone table near a fireplace. Mick Jagger had 4 amphetamine-based pills, which he'd had in Italy and left in a pocket and hadn't thought about.
No arrests were made that night. But once the suspected drugs were confirmed by the laboratories, Mick was charged with possession of amphetamines, and Keith with allowing his house to be used for the smoking of marijuana. If the conspiracy theory is correct, then it wasn't the drugs haul the FBI had allegedly been hoping for. But it was certainly enough to ruin the Rolling Stones' chances of ever getting a US visa.
In 1967, the potential sentence for allowing one's house for the smoking of cannabis was 10 years. You could get 10 years in jail for allowing someone to have a joint in your house.
4 months later, in June 1967, thousands of fans turned up to see Mick and Keith arrive for their trial. And Philip Norman believes that the judge was intent on destroying the Stones from the moment it started.
It was undoubtedly a show trial. It was indeed. A small local judge reacted in the most ridiculously excessive way. His name was Judge Block, and he was playing to the gallery all through the trial. It was his little moment of glory.
Evidence that an unnamed naked woman was sitting on a sofa with a rug around her when police raided Keith Richards' house at West Wittering was given in court today.
It was a show trial with ridiculous sentences.
It took the jury only an hour this afternoon to bring in a verdict of guilty, and now Keith Richards and Mick Jagger are waiting to be taken to prison.
Mick Jagger was sentenced to 3 months for his forgotten amphetamines, while Richards got a year for allowing his house to be used as a drugs den. So how did the Rolling Stones go from being locked up for drugs offences to becoming the rock legends they are today? Incredibly, their saviour was the Times newspaper, which did much to change the public mood.
The Times newspaper, which was a very, very conservative paper in the late 60s, realised this had gone much too far, and a famous editorial was published saying that Jagger had not been fairly treated. He had received much harsher treatment than any ordinary young man would have received.
The editorial was written by the Times editor, William Rees-Mogg, a man at the heart of the establishment. Partly as a result of the editorial, Richard's sentence was overturned, and Jagger was given a conditional discharge. By 1969, the Stones had their American visas. 6 decades on, the Rolling Stones are the longest-serving rock band in the world and are still sounding as good as ever.